In this video, I'll show you how to connect to a database in Flask using Flask-SQLAlchemy. So this can be any type of relational database, so SQLite, Postgres, MySQL. I'll be using SQLite in this example because it's the easiest one to get started with, but pretty much everything is going to be exactly the same except for one thing, and I'll mention that when I get to that point if you want to use a different database. So to get started, I have just from Flask import Flask, and I've instantiated the Flask app object. So now I'll import Flask-SQLAlchemy. So from Flask-SQLAlchemy, import SQLAlchemy, capital S, Q, L, and A, and then the rest is lowercase. Next, I want to add some configuration for the app. So the very first configuration value that I'll use is the SQLAlchemy database URI. So this is what I was talking about when it comes to using different database systems. It basically determines the database system by this first part of this URI. So if you look here, we see the different types of connection URIs. So for example, I'm using SQLite, as you can see there, but we also have Postgres, we have MySQL, we have Oracle. And the basic idea is that you have a username and a password, and then you have the location of the server, and then you have the name of your database. So this is all information you'll get from wherever you're hosting your database. So for example, if you have a database on Heroku, you'll get this information from them. If you host a Postgres database on Elephant SQL, for example, they'll give you this information. So basically you just copy and paste the information. So the username, the password, the location. Sometimes you can have the port, but typically databases use the same ports. And then the name of your database. So this all comes from the database itself, so I can't give you any more specific guidance there. And apart from that, everything else is going to be the same in this example. So it doesn't matter what database you use, the rest of the code will be exactly the same. So the next configuration value that I want to have is something called SQLAlchemy track modifications. This is just to reduce some warnings in the terminal when we're using this. You don't need to worry about what this does. So just set it to false. You don't even have to use this at all, but you'll just see some extra warnings in the terminal when you go to use a Flask app with Flask-SQLAlchemy. So the next thing I want to do is I want to instantiate the database object, and this will allow me to use the database both for the models that represent the tables in my database and for doing things like adding the data to the database, saving the database, and querying the database in some cases. So once that's done, I'll open up a Python REPL, and then what I'll do is I'll import the DB from app, and then I'll do db.createAll. So this will create the database for me. So in my case, since I'm using SQLite, it creates a SQLite file for me, as we can see over here. But if you're using something like MySQL or Postgres, you don't really create the database through this. Instead, you'll create the tables in the database. So your database will go from being empty basically to having whatever tables you've specified. So I haven't specified any models here that get translated to tables. I'll do that in a moment, and then I'll talk about what happens when you do that with Postgres and MySQL. But just know that you don't actually need to create a database like I did here, but I just want to show you it working. So here we see the SQLite file, and we know that Flask-SQLAlchemy is working properly. So the next thing I want to do is I want to create a very simple model. So this model represents a table in the database, and it's going to be a user model, something that pretty much everyone is familiar with. So every single model in Flask-SQLAlchemy needs to have an ID column that is a primary key. So it's like the main column of a table. And the reason why is because it's just how SQLAlchemy works internally. It's a way to keep track of all the objects that get created, so you need a unique ID. Also for the user, I'll have a name, and for the column, I'll use a string. So the first one is the integer column, the second one's going to be a string column. I'll have an email column as well, and the email column will also be a string. I'll make it a bit longer since emails could potentially be longer than a name. And in my system, I'll just say that all emails are unique. This doesn't have to be the case, but for my user system that I'm creating here, I'll just say unique equals true, meaning the email can only be inserted into the table one time. Finally, I'll have this date joined field. So db column and then db.date, and then the default will be datetime.utc-now. So UTC now returns a date time object, but since I'm using a date column here, it will kind of cut off the time and just put the date. And because I'm using datetime, I need to import it from datetime. So from datetime, import datetime. By the way, if you made it this far in the video, you're probably really interested in Flask-SQLAlchemy. So I've created a free course called Flask-SQLAlchemy Basics where I cover it in much more depth. So if you want to join this course, just go to my website, prettyprinted.com/FlaskSQL. I'll put a link in the description below as well if you want to click there. So back to the video. And now I'll start up a Python REPL again, and then I'll import DB and user. And then I'll do db.createAll again. So the first time I did this, it created the database itself because it's a SQLite database. But this time what I'll do is I'll create the tables by calling db.createAll. So if you're using Postgres or MySQL, then it's going to create the user table in your database as well. And just by looking at the SQLAlchemy tool on the command line here, I can see the tables that I have. I can see the schema. So that just confirms that the database and the table were created successfully. And then I can see the exact same thing here with my GUI database viewer. And what I'll do is I'll just add some data here manually because I don't want to focus on the queries in this video. I just want to focus on like connecting and making sure everything works. So I'm creating a new row where the ID will be 1, and then the name will be Anthony. Email will be anthony@prettyprinted.com, and then the date joined will be, let's say, January 1st of 2022. I'll go ahead and save that in my database here. So now that I have some data in the database, let me go ahead and take a look at it. So what I'll do is I'll import from app again. I'll import db and user again. And if I just do user.query.all, what I'll see is user1 in the database. And that simply represents the one row that I added in my table. So user1 is Anthony. And what I'll do here in the user model is I'll add this representation method, so repr. So what I'll do here is I'll return the actual email for the user. So I'll use an f string and then user, and I'll pass in the email there. So I'll close the Python REPL and open it up again. And then I'll import the same thing. So from app, import db and user. I really don't need db, but just by habit, I'm importing db. Then I'll use query.all on user. And then we see the email address that I manually entered into the database. So that just means that it's able to perform a query successfully, and we know that everything in the database is working. So that's it for this video. If you want to learn more, I have plenty of SQLAlchemy videos, and this is just the first step. And the next step is looking into how queries work in Flask-SQLAlchemy.